This morning's lecture is called Meaning, Representation and Conceptualization. Meaning is crucial for cognitive linguistics. Conceptualization is crucial for cognitive linguistics. And representation is a notion that has been central to cognitive science for the last 50 years or so. No concept has been more central, nor more problematic in cognitive science than representation. In classical cognitivism, the mind is viewed as a system of language-like mental representations. These representations consist of symbolic strings manipulated by algorithmic rules. In strong formulations of the theory of the computational mind, such language-like representations and the syntactic rules governing them are all there is in the mind. That's it. The idea is that you can achieve a complete a complete theory of the human mind by producing these kind of language-like representations and the rules. And this sounds a bit crazy, but believe me, it certainly used to be the case that people believed this. I remember going in the 1980s to a conference at which I heard a guy, an artificial intelligence guy who worked in language, saying that all they had to do was find the right sort of natural computer language and the rules for it, and they would be able to produce an intelligent machine, and they would have a full explanation of the human mind. And the idea is that this computational system is somehow instantiated in the brain. It's somehow in there, in your brain. And you could say that this is the way in which they try to solve the mind-body problem, the traditional problem of the relationship between the mind and the body, or the problem of physical symbols. So actually, in classical cognitivism, in your brain, you've got these symbols, okay? These symbols have got a physical reality in your brain, which is a bit of a problem, because how did they get there, and where are they? And why can't you see them if you open up brains? Well, that may be a naive kind of criticism. But also, the idea is that somehow this computational system has got to be interfaced with the world outside the organism, outside the brain. And this is often known as the grounding problem, or the symbol grounding problem. What about meaning, though? I mean, what's all this got to do with meaning? Well, this is how it goes. And those of you who know the work of Lakoff know that Lakoff is very critical of a point of view that he calls objectivism. And that is, it's not just Lakoff who calls it objectivism. So for classical cognitivism, meaning is an objective, truth-based relationship between the symbol, or symbol string, and states of affairs in the world. And this is model theoretic formal semantics. And its history goes from the logician Carnap in the 1930s, 40s, I think, I'm not sure, through to a particular formal language called Montague grammar, which was supposed to give a formal description in an objectivist kind of point of view of natural languages. And again, I remember years ago, people got really excited about this Montague grammar stuff, and they tried to think that maybe you could really describe what's going on inside people's heads in this way. I was never quite so enthusiastic myself, I must say. Anyway, that's objectivism, and it means that all meaning, not just linguistic meaning, but all meaning, including non-linguistic meanings, are symbolic in a very special sense, consisting in a relationship between an internal symbol and an external object or state of affairs. And cognition is nothing else except the process of the manipulation of symbol strings by algorithms. Algorithms are essentially mathematical operations which take one string on the left and transform it into another string on the right. Well, it doesn't have to be left and right, but they just transform one string into another string. And that was the basis of Chomsky's original idea many years ago of a transformational generative grammar. So look, if that's what it's all about, where do the meanings of the physical symbols come from? In other words, like, how do they actually get to hook up with the world outside? Because so far we're just talking about this computational system which is churning away inside people's heads. How does it relate to the outside world? If mental representation is structured like a language under a formal description, you may remember yesterday what I quoted from Fodor, a syntactical machine with semantic criteria of coherence. Well, if that's what it's like, then Chomsky's argument from the poverty of the stimulus also applies to mental representational symbols. Therefore, according to Fodor, who is the arch-high priest philosopher of this point of view, the language of thought is innate. In other words, according to Fodor, human infants are not only born with a universal grammar, a la Chomsky, but they're also born with a language of thought which kind of hooks up with the world outside. Now, some people believe this. I never believed it. I thought it was mad. I still think it's mad. And I realize that the people who advocate it are not only not stupid, but they're extremely intelligent. I mean, Fodor is one of the he's a world-renowned philosopher. So it's not stupidity, but there is something wrong with it. The idea that I am born with all the concepts that I need for the rest of my life. I just can't buy that idea. Not as a developmental psychologist. But if we want an alternative, we have to sort of be just as good. Anyway, it seems to me, and I've always asked myself, reading people like Fodor, and actually Chomsky for that matter, how can this be true? How could we be born with this universal grammar and language of thought for the semantics? How could such a system possibly emerge in biological evolution? Is there no missing link between the general purpose learning mechanisms of the behaviorists and the dedicated processing modules of the nativists? And if not, where did cognition, real cognition, begin in evolution? Did this language of thought kind of come out of the sky, out of nowhere? Or was it just some kind of amazing biological, miraculous event? Now, these psychological arguments, I would add, their philosophical and psychological arguments of doubt. But they add further force to the criticism that is made by many cognitive linguists, from Lakoff, Lanaka, all the kind of famous cognitive linguists, who argue that formalism cannot adequately account for meaning in natural language, or for important phenomena such as metaphor and polysemy. So I'm saying, not only can it not really account for language itself, it definitely can't account for how cognition gets there in the first place. And for me, as a developmental psychologist, I always ask myself about development. I always ask, how the hell did it get there? There are, of course, alternatives to cognitivism. Now, the first alternative is to get rid of representation altogether. It's too troublesome. It misleads us. Let's get rid of it. As I pointed out yesterday, ecological psychologists, starting with Gibson, have argued against the need for an inferential account of perception, because they claim direct perception will do the job. We really do actually basically just see the world as it is. No problem. And there's another set of people called the dynamic systems theorists. And they emphasize that highly complex forms of behavior can emerge in relatively simple organisms like insects without any kind of representational control. And their arguments are partly based on robotics. Because you can get robots to do pretty clever things without building in complicated artificial intelligence stuff or trying to simulate a brain. You just basically let the body and some simple programs work. And so this point of view is called emergentism, or at least it's one version of emergentism, the idea that actually things just... dynamic systems theory is the idea that out of a lot of relatively simple subsystems, the way that they operate together and coordinate, end up coordinating and cooperating, these simple subsystems, you end up with quite a complicated higher level system which doesn't have any controller, but so it doesn't have any representation, but it's still very efficient in getting around the place. And it works very well for things like functions like locomotion and to some extent vision. So maybe a non-representational embodied inactive theory involving direct perception plus perception action linkages can be sufficient. That's one point of view. Not mine. Now, some of you will have read Lakoff and Johnson's book from 1999 called Philosophy in the Flesh. Lakoff and Johnson's 99 theory is non-representational in this sense, because they emphasize, harking back to our discussions yesterday, that image schemas are preconceptual, not conceptual. They ground the different senses of polysemous items, like prepositions, in image schemas, so suggesting that linguistic meaning is at base pre-conceptual. They avoid the term representation. In fact, they say they avoid the term representation, and they say rather it's all about interaction between organism and environment. And they derive abstract meanings from embodied experiential preconceptual meanings through domain-to-domain conceptual metaphoric mapping. So in a way, their theory is a non-representational theory. But by the way, Am I going at the right speed? I'm not too, is it okay? Or am I going too fast? It's okay. But I have problems with Lakoff and Johnson, this 99 theory, because it's not clear whether there are any truly conceptual meanings at all in that theory, and if so, how do they differ from preconceptual image schematic meanings? Perhaps you could say that it's simply the interdomain mapping potential of the system that makes it conceptual. But that would suggest that it's only the abstract metaphoric meanings that are conceptual, whereas all the other concrete meanings are preconceptual. And that suggests that linguistic meaning in Lakoff and Johnson's theory is reduced to and eventually identical to schematic and inactive meaning. But if that's true, in what way are humans any different as symbol users from other species? So it's just like every other non-representationalist theory. It ends up really not explaining how humans use language at all. So for Lakoff and Johnson, is language a symbolic system at all, or is it just an expression of pre-symbolic schemas? So, instead of getting rid of representation, let's try alternative 2, which is rethinking representation, trying to reconceptualize the notion of representation. This is something which I've been doing since my book in 1988, and I'm hoping that I will eventually be proved right. Now, this second alternative does have some definite points of agreement with the first alternative, okay? The first alternative was to get rid of representation. The second alternative is to rethink it. So where do we agree? We agree that meaning is not only linguistic, but because, you know, we're all cognitive linguists in some sense or another. These are the basic propositions of cognitive linguistics. Meaning is not only linguistic. In fact, we agree that meaning is not even primarily linguistic. We do agree that meaning is in some very wide sense, and a sense that applies not only to humans but also to other organisms as well, as we discussed when we discussed ecological approaches in general. We agree that meaning is in the relationship between the organism and its ecological niche, or Umwelt. And we agree that linguistic meanings are continuous with non-linguistic meanings, such as schemas. There's some kind of continuity. But we also have some profound disagreements with alternative 1. Why? Because I am saying that linguistic meanings do have a very special representational and symbolic character. It's just that classical cognitivism and all that computational business has got it wrong. They don't have the right account of it. Secondly, because if we want to think about the human ecological niche, the one that we live in as a species, it is symbolic. So why do we pretend that it's not symbolic and that we can treat it in the same way as non-symbolic niches? But here we start to meet up again with some more mainstream cognitive linguistic propositions that language is a communicative system permitting representational and symbolic communication. That's what Lanaka says too. Language needs to be analyzed as one communication system amongst others, but one with very special characteristics. Because language makes possible true conceptualization. Also, in making possible true conceptualization, it also permits virtual cognition, cognition which goes beyond the here and now. Anything which has no representation at all, okay? Any organism without representation at all is kind of stuck in the here and now. It can't talk about yesterday or tomorrow. It can't talk about possible states, possible situations which have not yet been encountered. It can't talk about imaginary characters in narratives, because you need symbolization to do that. That's a point that was made very many years ago by a linguist, an American linguist called Charles Hockett, who wrote a beautiful article whose name I've forgotten. But it was actually something like, it was basically on, what do you need to be a language? What things does a language have to be a language? And one of those characteristics was displacement, the ability to talk about virtual realities. So when we rethink representation, the first thing we do is we say, representation is not an objective relationship between symbol and object, or symbol string and states of affairs. It's nothing like what these formal logicians do in that sense. Instead, representation is a relationship established in the course of communication between speaker, hearer, and situation. And linguistic representation is based in the communicative use of the sign system of language. And all other uses, including the use of language signs to represent the world for oneself, which we do all the time, because we sort of talk to ourselves, we use language as a medium for inner speech, as Vygotsky called it, a medium of our thinking for ourselves. But that is secondary. The basis of linguistic representation is communication. And that's a completely different point of view from the point of view of classical cognitivism, for which communication is only secondary. Now, we're going to get to the nitty-gritty of this, and we're going to try and define the notion of representation. And I do this by specifying what I call the conditions on representation. And they go as follows. To represent something is to cause something, the signifier, to stand for something else, the signified, in such a way that the relationship of standing for and whatever it is that is represented are recognizable to the listener. There we are. That's a representation. Look, we're talking about this bit in particular. I'm causing something to stand for something else. Well, this pattern, this pattern here of shapes on a background makes up a figure, and that figure is a signifier which stands for something else, the signified meaning of it. Okay? And the meaning of it is a man on a horse, or what is the signified is a man on a horse. And you can only really figure that out if you know that there is a standing for relationship, because you could be mistaken and look at this and say, oh, it's just an abstract pattern, doesn't stand for anything. But if you do know that it stands for something, you'll try and figure out what it does stand for, and what it stands for is whatever is represented. So you've recognized both those things, and there you are. You see a man on a horse. So this logic of the conditions of representation, okay? This is a philosophical logical point. It doesn't just apply to language. That's what representation is, whether we're talking about representation or something else. The representational relationship is independent of the medium of representation, which may be linguistic, gestural, or pictorial. For example, to use traditional semiotics of Charles Sanders Peirce, maps combine iconic and symbolic representations to produce a single representational synthesis. There's a map of China. Here, because the map traces the shape of the physical geography of China, it's iconic, okay? It's got an iconic relationship. But also, it's got a lot of words in it, so it's also symbolic. And the symbolic and the iconic sort of collaborate together to produce a representation. Language and representation. Language is a symbolic semiotic system. The core symbolic function of language is representation. But representation is a function of language, okay? It's not like Fodor and the other classical cognitivists believe. It's not like, it's not the kind of a priori inner symbol. It's actually representation is the core symbolic function of real language, the language that you speak and the language that I speak. Representation is both communicatively and cognitively complex, okay? When I told you the conditions on representation, they're not simple. And communicative representation, this is a hypothesis, was the key functional attribute driving the evolution of language. That's what was selected for. And that's what I will talk about this afternoon, as a matter of fact. Now, the next point is where we meet up with a very important notion in cognitive linguistics. And I'm going to say now, linguistic representation is the same as linguistic conceptualization. That's what it is. So language represents by means of concepts. And these concepts are the concepts that, if you remember our lecture yesterday, they're the concepts that the philosopher Kant called discursive concepts. We could also call them linguistic concepts. So what does language represent? Okay, we've been talking about this function of language. What is represented? It is often said, including by cognitive linguistics, that language represents ideas or concepts or image schemas, etc. That's not what I'm saying, okay? I say language represents by means of concepts, which is different. But the idea that language is basically just there for representing ideas has a very long history. Let's see how ancient this idea is. Here is Aristotle from the 3rd century before the Common Era. Words are signs or symbols of the affections of the soul. Whereas the affections of the soul are not signs or symbols of things in the real world, but copies of them, although natural copies, and therefore identical for the human race. So that's what he believed. And that's actually a lot of what Kant was arguing against. Remember, Kant said, you know, concepts, they can't actually be images. And the idea that they're images or copies came all the way back down from the ages from Aristotle. But Aristotle then also says words are the signs or the symbols of these images. Let's jump a few centuries, getting on for 1,000 years, and the British empiricist philosopher John Locke says, that then which words are the marks of are the ideas of the speaker, nor can anyone apply them as marks immediately to anything else but the ideas that he himself hath. Sorry about the archaic English. Okay, so words are marks of ideas, or signs of ideas. And then the father of modern linguistics, as he's often called, Ferdinand de Saussure, writing or lecturing in around about 1919, says, the linguistic sign unites not a thing and a name, but a concept and a sound image. Despite its antiquity, this proposal is misleading, although it's not entirely wrong. We could perhaps say that words signify concepts. But the mistake then is to think that this signifying of concepts is the same as representing concepts, because they don't. Words perhaps may be said to signify concepts, but they represent what is conceptualized. An alternative formulation would go something like this. And this is what I think is the right interpretation of cognitive linguistics and cognitive semantics. Linguistic expressions represent linguistically conceptualized situations. So representation, to use a wonderful phrase of Jerome Bruner, representation is an act of meaning. Linguistic expressions represent linguistically conceptualized situations. This formulation emphasizes several things. The contextuality of meaning, because a situation is a context, right? The fact that representation is based in communication. The nature of meaning as a conventional mapping from conceptualization to expression. And the distinction between linguistic conceptualization, Kant's discursive concepts, and preconceptual schemas. Representational meaning. The representational meaning of a term or expression can be considered as equivalent to the traditional notion of sense, which is its signified content as a discursive concept, enabling it to fulfill in discourse the conditions on representation. Now, I'm not going to go into the now quite old arguments about the distinction between sense and reference in philosophy of language. But Frege, who kind of inaugurated the use of this term sense he thought it was a kind of, senses were kind of Platonic entities. He didn't think they were there inside the head. He thought they were Platonic entities somehow in the universe. Karl Bühler in 1939 had a very good riposte to Frege, and he gave a socio-cultural variant of Fregean sense. Bühler said, Plato called objects that manifest similarities to linguistic meanings ideas, but objective ideas in an ideal world. And Bühler goes on to say that we have transformed the eternal and immutable into intersubjective only needs to be said in order to exclude misunderstandings. So sense is essentially a mapping pattern. And I'm proposing that instead of seeing senses as mental objects or schemas or nodes in semantic networks, we should view them as relatively stable or entrenched patterns of mapping, from contextualized conceptualization to linguistic expression, in the course of the dynamic construction of acts of meaning, in which the goal of the action is to successfully achieve, through linguistic means, joint reference in an intersubjectively shared universe of discourse. I know that's a mouthful, but there you are. That's what I think it is. Let's just remind you again of the conditions on representation. To represent something is to cause something to stand for something else in such a way that the relationship of standing for and whatever it is that is represented are recognizable to the listener. But now we have to add to this, recognizable to the listener in the intersubjectively shared situation, the shared universe of discourse. And this brings us to the question of reference, the question, as it were, of aboutness. That's the way that the philosopher John Searle tries to characterize the notion of reference. It's aboutness. So, if I, for example, if I say this cup, yeah? What is my utterance or expression, this cup, about? Well, there's two answers. Basically, either the expression this cup could actually be about this cup, or it could be about something in here, my representation of this cup. Now you'll gather that actually I believe that when we use the expression this cup, it's about this cup. Not about my concept of the cup or my idea of the cup. It's about this cup. But I can only use that expression, this cup, because this cup, the expression, this cup, linguistically conceptualizes that thing there. Unfortunately, many cognitive linguists also seem to believe that words refer not to the world, but to conceptualizations. You'll actually find this in the literature. And this is erroneous. Words and expressions refer to the world in the ecological sense of the reality of the Umwelt, but they do so in a mediating fashion, not because they magically hook up with the world, but because we mean them to do that. Because we refer. In fact, words mediate reference by speakers. They don't have reference on their own. Words on their own, in the absence of their use, are just dead things. Words only acquire these magical properties of sense and reference when they're actually used by speakers, and when they're actually used by speakers in some kind of situation. And that means we can only refer linguistically to the world using the representational meanings available in our language, which I think is what is meant by the rather enigmatic and cryptic phrase taken from the philosophy of the late Wittgenstein, who said, "Whereof we cannot speak, we must remain silent," because we can only refer linguistically to the world using the representational meanings available in our language. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that the world consists only of what, I don't think Wittgenstein is saying the world consists only of what our language, the world consists only of our linguistic meanings. No, he's not saying this. He says what we can speak about is given by the representational meanings in our language. And of course that leads us to the question of linguistic relativity. If the senses or representational meanings in one language differ from those in another, in what sense is it possible to refer to the same things in the same way in these two different languages? So, we do not therefore refer to a merely linguistically constructed reality. And this argument that I'm making is an argument against all versions of solipsism. Solipsism being basically the idea that I, as an individual, am trapped in my own world, and including what I call neural solipsism, neural variety of solipsism. We refer to a directly perceived reality, or sometimes when we use language we refer to a symbolically mediated world in which we are engaged as embodied and discursive actors. This world is schematized linguistically, conceptually, and also preconceptually. But it is the world we speak about, not the contents of something called a mind-brain, which is a fiction dreamed up by certain misguided cognitive scientists. Please note that this is not objectivism. Linguistic expressions represent linguistically conceptualized situations. This semiotic relationship is not the same as saying that linguistic expressions represent objective states of affairs, because linguistic representation also implies conceptual construal or schematization, and of course it also implies users. Now, what I've said to you is that senses or representational meanings are in essence the same as what Immanuel Kant called discursive concepts. And now I'm going to tell you a few properties of such discursive concepts. Discursive concepts are public because they are anchored in a language system, and a language system is the property of a community. Remember Wittgenstein's argument against the possibility of a private language. So discursive concepts are public. Discursive concepts are normative. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that there are right and wrong ways of right and wrong ways of using them, involving right and wrong ways of talking about the world. So, if I say, this cup, that's okay, that's correct in English. If I say, this egg, it's wrong Okay? It's incorrect in English. That's normativity. And thirdly, which is actually just the same thing, they are intersubjectively shared. They are, discursive concepts are shared meanings. So in a sense we could say metaphorically that discursive concepts are the property of the language community, and to continue this metaphor, they are only loaned by the individual language user who employs them. And that's a metaphor which we owe to the Russian linguist and literary theorist Bakhtin. In fact, I think he said something like that when we use the language, we are like tenants in the house of language. We're just temporarily occupying it. Another thing about discursive concepts, they develop and change over historical time. So, for example, we could say, let's take an example. An example would be a concept like wheel, okay? Now, originally, presumably, a wheel was the kind of thing which was fitted to the vehicle to enable it to have locomotion when it was pulled or pushed by somebody or some animal. But now, for example, if we say the wheel of a car, we could mean either the wheel which is in contact with the road, or, at least in English, the wheel that the driver uses to steer the car. And there are many, many such examples which cognitive linguists who study things like grammaticalization processes have looked at. Discursive concepts are not fixed for all time, which they would have to be if they were something like Fodor's language of thought. No, they change over time because communities change and the world changes and we change the world. But as well as discursive concepts, we do also have what I shall call psychological concepts. Because in order for discursive concepts to be employed by any speaker, that speaker does have to have some kind of psychological, personal equivalent of that that discursive concept. So psychological concepts are subjective, individual, and variable. They need not be shared by the whole community. So, for example, here we are in the Beihang University of Aeronautics and Astronautics, and somewhere within 1 kilometer of here, there must be an awful lot of people who know a hell of a lot about concepts like, I don't know, re-entry velocity. Now me, I don't know much about that. My psychological concept of that discursive concept is pretty minimal. And that is a manifestation of what the philosopher Hilary Putnam, calls the social division of linguistic labor. It's not necessary for everybody in every linguistic community to know everything about every concept which is available in that community. It's not possible, especially in complex, technologically advanced societies such as ours. But even in less complex societies, not everybody knows everything. There may be arcane or ritual knowledge, which is restricted to certain groups, a priesthood perhaps. So along with the notion of social authority, Putnam also proposes the notion of cognitive authority, which is basically expert knowledge. If you want to know about the concept of re-entry velocity, go and ask an authority, somebody with cognitive authority, somebody who really knows about the subject. And then maybe, if you're lucky, you'll bring your psychological concept into line with that of the expert, and you'll be able to use the discursive concept with more expertise. And of course, that is what the process of education is all about. It is about expanding our psychological concepts so that they match the full specification of the discursive concept. So while discursive concepts develop and change over historical time, psychological concepts develop and change over ontogenetic time, the time of the development of the individual. Let me give you another example. Let's take the term atom. We know from the history of science that the term atom is a very old one. The history of science and philosophy of science books will tell us that it goes back to somebody called Lucretius, who had an atomistic theory of matter. He was an ancient philosopher. And for all I know, there may well have been ancient Chinese philosophers as well, which were atomistic theories of matter. Were these the same theories as our modern theory of the atom? Absolutely not. No. This term atom, it's kind of got some kind of continuity down through the ages as a discursive concept, but it's also changed. It's changed because our knowledge has changed. It's changed because our discourses in the science of physics have changed. So it's changed over historical time. And if you want to educate people, you need to get their psychological concepts up to the level of our most advanced contemporary employments of these discursive concepts in scientific theories. Okay. Let's return to this problem that has been posed by classical cognitivist theories of representation, the so-called symbol grounding problem. In the traditional formulation is something like, how do symbols hook up with the world? And this is cast as a theoretical problem. Philosophers beat their brains out over this theoretical problem. How do I get the symbols to match up with the world? But it's not a theoretical problem. In fact, I would say there is no problem at all, since symbols emerge in communicative practice in contexts of participatory sense-making by speaking human beings. Symbol grounding develops through the coordination in development of psychological meanings with discursive meanings. The psychological meanings are grounded in functional image schemas, and here we agree with Lakoff and Johnson. They're grounded in functional image schemas and perception-action linkages, but they're also grounded in discursive meanings which the developing person has to appropriate. And these themselves are grounded in the conventions of the language system of the language community. So the grounding is through the coordination of psychological meanings with discursive meanings. The coordination, if you like, of the subjective with the intersubjective. And that is a dual grounding process of sensory motor and discursive grounding. And sensory motor and discursive grounding, or sensory motor plus discursive grounding, is what I call dual grounding, and I will talk some more about it this afternoon. So this is my last slide, in which I come back to my definition of what I call the socio-naturalistic approach in cognitive science and cognitive linguistics. The socio-naturalistic approach bases itself in both the evolutionary biological and the socio-cultural ecology of the human mind, in which language is a part of human ecology and specifically of human symbolic ecology, and in which it is simultaneously a product of biological evolution and of cultural evolution, which means it is a product of biological cultural co-evolution. And that is a process that I will talk about this afternoon. So thank you very much.